Everybody make sure you have a good seat to sit, okay? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Nesquehoning Historical Society today on this beautiful day to hear Vince's presentation. We really appreciate it. Keeping our history alive is the only way to do it. I mean, we must tell the stories. Don't forget, pass the stories on. Without it, it dies. So we appreciate all you being here. Can we stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance?
It's okay, you can stand.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with justice and okay, Vince, I'm going to turn the program over.
You can sit.
Very much, Vince, for being here.
Scoot back and get comfortable.
Ed, how does that sound back there? Good? Okay. Too loud?
Well, it's up to people in the back.
Too loud? Too loud?
A little bit.
A little bit too loud? Okay. How about now?
Good.
Okay. All right. Thank you for coming to this presentation on uranium in Carbon County. Normally, I do a presentation when I'm releasing a new book, and I don't have a book on uranium. There's probably not enough material to turn it into a book, although someday maybe I'll incorporate it into like a compilation on the local history. But it's a fascinating subject, and I kind of found out about it through Jim Thorpe, a man named Davy Miller, which we'll see a picture of him later on. Anyway, the story starts in 1886 when a Philadelphia newspaper named The Times reported that the Mock-Chunk Democrat had an article about some uranium being found in the mountains near Mock-Chunk. Now, I went and looked for a copy of that issue, and we don't have them in the Dimmick. The Dimmick Memorial Library collection of local newspapers, while it's pretty good, is missing some issues. So I couldn't pursue it from that respect, but I kept going on, and that article in the Philadelphia newspaper didn't mention who discovered the uranium in Mock-Chunk. But I kept going on in 1886 in the Mock-Chunk newspapers and eventually found an article in September that reported the discovery and who made it. And that was Dr. Bertine S. Irwin. And the Mock-Chunk Daily Times for September 23rd, 1886 said, "The find of uranium in the Switchback Mountains near Mock-Chunk by Dr. B.S. Irwin of that borough consists of a vein 8 to 10 inches thick. The outstrippings were traced for fully half a mile, and uranium is worth $980 a pound, and Dr. Irwin thinks there are millions of dollars worth of it in Carbon County." And of course, the mention of money sparked a lot of interest. Now, some of the sources back then said that Dr. Irwin's find was the first discovery of uranium in America. That's not true. In 1874, when they were doing the second geological survey of Pennsylvania, they found uranium in Mount Pisgah in 1874. It never got reported in the newspapers at the time. It was just noticed in the geological survey report. And that's kind of what it looks like. It's a yellow salt of uranium, and it was discovered in Europe in 1789, and it was in present-day Czech Republic, and it was first discovered in the United States in 1871 in gold mines near Colorado. And that's another picture of Dr. Irwin. He's a fascinating gentleman, and if you come to my Christmas show, we'll talk more about Dr. Irwin, because he put together, I don't know how to pronounce it, puts or putts, but they were these displays of little houses and stuff that they put under the Christmas tree. And Dr. Irwin did that every year in Mock-Chunk, and I've got some pictures of that. And he sported a Van Dyke beard, and he had a cane that he could store medicine in the top of, and he was known for storing a lot of laudanum for his women patients. And he lived on Opera House Hill in a house that was called Crestmere or Castlemere. And that was in 1900 that he moved in. And just to give you an idea where that was located, there's the Upper Mock-Chunk Cemetery and there's the Opera House. And the ruins of that house are still there. That's what it looked like before it burned down. And then were the ruins about maybe 15 years ago. And some people had bought that property and they built a house there, and they incorporated the ruins of Dr. Irwin's castle into their house. And it's kind of nice. They did a good job. Now in 1985, Jim Thorpe resident named Bill Johnston wrote an article for the Valley Gazette speculating that Dr. Irwin was experimenting with the uranium and the radioactivity in his castle on the hill. But we know that that wasn't true because radium and radiation weren't even known at that point in time. At the time Dr. Irwin discovered uranium, it was used for coloring in ceramics and glassware. That's all it was used for. They didn't know anything about radiation at that point in time. It was in 1895 that William Röntgen discovered X-rays, which are a form of electromagnetic radiation more penetrating than visible light or radio waves. That was in 1895. A year later, Henri Becquerel discovered radioactivity, which again is gamma radiation, but it's even higher in energy than X-rays. So there's no way that Dr. Irwin was experimenting with radiation because nobody even knew about it. And the discovery of radiation and X-rays was by accident. He was experimenting with uranium salts, and he had placed them on top of some keys, and below it was a photographic plate. And when he developed the photographic plate, he saw there was an image of the keys on the plate. And so they realized that something was being given off by this substance, and by theorizing and stuff, they came up with the concept of these electromagnetic rays. Well, there's some other interesting things that were happening around the same time as they discovered the uranium that left me thinking there was a connection. And that was the construction of the Soldiers' Monument at the foot of Packer Hill, right next to the courthouse. And of course, that monument is still there. They had been planning to build that as early as 1873, but it wasn't until the 1880s that they did anything with it. And in March of that year, they awarded the contract to the Monumental Bridge Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And a man named George Pace was hired for the base of the monument. And I have his name in red because some other stuff happened that leads me to believe there was a connection. Well, they were going to lay the cornerstone for that monument in a full Masonic ceremony on the 4th of July, 1886. But they had to cancel it because the night before, somebody went in and took apart the form for the base and chipped off part of the base. Now, why would anybody do that? They had to make a new cornerstone, and it was laid without the Masonic ceremony 2 weeks later. Why would somebody go to the hassle of chipping off the corner of the monument base? For a sample of the rock? Maybe. That's what I think. We have to fast forward because there's nothing else in the papers or anywhere in our history about the uranium until 1898. Or not necessarily the uranium, but a connection. And that was that George Pace was planning to build a big quarry on the road between Mock Chunk and Nesquehoning. The same guy that had been involved in building the base for the monument. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. So anyway, he signed a lease that year for a piece of ground 1,500 by 300 feet on the public road leading to Nesquehoning, and he said it was for the purpose of preparing quarry stone. And that's the section of land over there. We're looking towards Jim Thorpe here, and this whole piece of land, all the way, Dead Man Spring is around the corner here, and all that land was part of the lease. And there's Mount Pisgah. Now we're really close, and here's where they would later drill 3 tunnels into the base of Mount Pisgah. Well, the Mock Chunk Times reported on that. It said, a New Jersey capitalists have leased a large tract of land on the outskirts of town for the purpose of quarrying large deposits of building and ornamental stone on an extensive scale. A deposit of uranium on the tract may also be worked. So I think that was all a result of George Pace taking a piece of that base of the monument and realizing that they could make some money quarrying stone and then maybe some from the uranium. And here's some of the ads that were showing up at the time. This is from the Allentown newspaper. Better than gold, mineral discovered near Mauch Chunk which yields $24,000 a ton. But then nothing else happened with that. The quarry never materialized and there was nothing else written about it until 4 years later. And it was all about because of the trolley. And so the Mauch Chunk trolley, which had been in operation for a few years, was going to be connected to Lansford, Nesquehoning, and eventually Tamaqua. And so they were carving out a track at the base of the Northern Liberties near Mauch Chunk, on the base of Mount Pisgah, near the Northern Liberties. And rock blasting there throughout 1902 exposed the carnotite veins, which carnotite is a sample that has uranium in it. And Lehigh University students came up, so the word spread, and Lehigh University students came up to explore the discovery. And this is Liberty's Curve. And at that point in time, right now Route 209 is there, but at this time,
That's where we
it was
drive.
the trolley.
It was the
And the
trolley
road
before.
from Nesquehoning was down there. It was on what was called the river plain for the Room Run Railroad. And the Room Run Railroad
Down
was
by
a
the
gravity
river where we
railroad
go on
that
the
ran
train.
from the mines near Nesquehoning along present-day 209 and went down the hill there to some wharves on the river. And you could see where the Central Railroad shops were at the time. But while they were blasting for these tracks, for the trolley tracks,
Plain
they
House
exposed
Hill,
more
River
of
Plain,
the uranium
Railroad.
deposits.
1868.
And that's where they drilled those tunnels later on. And we'll see more about that. Now this is the same curve, but it's looking from the other direction. So you can see Plain House Hill
That's how we go.
and the CRNJ shops and the Northern Liberties Road, which this is the present road from Mauch Chunk, and there you can see the trolley tracks as well. Now later, they would move the Nesquehoning Highway up there and eliminate this road down there. Well, this man, he was studying the carnotite, the uranium deposits in these rocks that were exposed by the trolley, and he wrote an article in Science Magazine in 1909, this whole write-up about the Mauch Chunk uranium discovery. And this doctor read that article, and he was experimenting with radium as a cure for cancer. And radium is a daughter product of uranium. So uranium is radioactive, and what it means for a material to be radioactive is that the atom is unstable, and so it decays into elements with a lower atomic number, and it does that by emitting radiation. Well, one of the daughter products is radium. It's very highly penetrating, very radioactive, and at the time, they were inserting rods of this radium in people next to the tumor, and it was a very, very, very painful way of treating cancer patients. I read stories where the people would scream in pain just from the radiation burns they were getting. And articles appeared all over the United States about the Mauch Chunk uranium deposits. This newspaper article, I think, was from a California newspaper. And it's showing the bottom of Mount Pisgah and the path of the Mauch Chunk Lansford trolley. And that was the doctor there that was looking into, developing these Mauch Chunk deposits so that he could produce radium for his cancer treatments. Again, nothing's heard for several more years. I mean, absolutely nothing. It's like the window closes on Mauch Chunk uranium. But that year, the doctor returned to verify the deposits. And they, every time it happened, the newspapers would continue to boom it as a way for Mauch Chunk to recover some of its economic interests. Because after the turn of the century, after around 1900, petroleum and oil started to take over in America as a fuel, and anthracite started declining. It wouldn't be until World War I that our anthracite production would go back up. And here are some of the articles that showed up in the paper. Deposits of uranium at Mauch Chunk, alleged cure for cancer, visits Mount Pisgah. And that previous doctor, Dr. Worry, he said that our deposits had 2% uranium oxide, and that, from a ton of that, 180 milligrams of radium, could be produced by chemical treatment. And a milligram of radium at the time was worth $180. And so again, they were looking at this as a source of money. Some of the stuff is scary. This article claims that radium could be used to treat cancer, lupus, eczema, and other nerve diseases. And these are, this is from an article in the Reading Times. And this one is from Allentown. And it was advertising uranium water. It said it's recommended for dyspepsia and indigestion. It furnishes an element required in the process of digestion, which is not true. It is a direct aid to assimilation of food. The remedy arrests the disorder by stopping fermentation. 2-gallon jug will convince you only $3. Contains a full month's treatment. You never would want to drink water with uranium in it. Yes, Micah.
There was a businessman in the 1920s who was convinced that radioactive water was a cure-all, and they sold a thing called a radithor, which was a stoneware jug, and it had a uranium insert you put in it, and you ran your tap water through that. You just drank irradiated water all day.
Oh.
You needed it so,
I wonder if it really was. I wonder if it was real. I wonder if
yeah, it was. He died from cancer.
Oh, he did. Oh, okay.
Killed him. And somebody found a radithor in an antique shop in Canada like 20 years ago, and it had irradiated the whole antique shop.
Wow. Yeah, they use in nuclear power plants. They use small discs of radium and cesium for radiographic for checking pipes to see if they have cracks in them. And what has happened over time is people would forget the sample behind and leave, and people would pick up these discs, not realizing that they were highly radioactive, put them in their pocket, take them home or whatever, and have all kinds of health problems, the radiation levels. But we'll talk more about uranium in the water later on in this talk. But yeah, I'm thinking that this really wasn't true. It was probably just water that he advertised, because where would he get the uranium to put in the water? Unless you want to mock chunk and scrape it off the rock. But in early 1914, the first tunnel was driven into the base of Mount Pisgah in order to find more samples, determine how extensive the samples were. There would eventually be 3 tunnels drilled. Again, another article. Radium found in our coal region, now proven by government experts, may bring fame and new industry. So I'm kind of like backing up now because I'm taking to the beginning of the story because the reason I found out about all this was this picture here, which I took one day while hiking, and I noticed, and I'm looking at Mount Pisgah there's Flagstaff, and I noticed these 3 roads going across the north face of Mount Pisgah. And I couldn't for the life of me think of what those roads were for. And you can see them again in this picture. There's a little bit clearer. And so, and even in this postcard shows 2 of them. And this postcard's probably from around 1914. We can see the Kemmerer Mansion there, and that was not torn down until 1927. And the Moose Hall, which was built like in the 1890s. And that's what one of the road looks like to this day. They're pretty well overgrown with, I can't think of the name of that plant. Not mountain laurel. Rhododendron. Gee, man. Oh well. And anyway, on these roads I found these casings. So okay, I'm thinking there's drilling going on. Well, I went to visit this man who I spent a lot of time talking to over the years. Mr. David Miller. He lived in Upper Chunk. And if you ever hike up Mount Pisgah and you go up the wagon road, he had his garage right across the bottom from the wagon road, so that's near your house. And his garage was full of switchback stuff. He worked for the Lehigh Coal Navigation Company. He worked as the conductor on the switchback, and he loved to talk about it. And he would always bring out his scrapbooks with pictures. And I have a lot of tape recordings of my talks with him, but I'm trying to get them turned into a digital file so that I can entertainment. And he told me that they were roads for the diamond drillers. Now, all but 2 of them. So the very, very bottom road, which comes out at the bottom of Sand Miller Field, was actually a bridle path for the Kemmerer Mansion. And there's Mount Pisgah. Mount Pisgah Plain. At the very top, the road leads to an old coal mine. It was the Mount Pisgah coal mine. It was actually discovered in 1834 by the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. It really wasn't great coal, but they used it to burn in the Mount Pisgah engine house. And during the Depression, there were some families in Upper Mock Chunk that they had an old car that they took out the back of it, and they would fill it with coal and drive it down the wagon road and sell the coal in Mock Chunk. And the coal would weight the car down so far that the back would hit the ground. That would help break it going down Mount Pisgah. Now, the tunnel's blasted shut. It was blasted shut by the LCMN during the Depression because it was too dangerous for people to go through. It was toward the end of the Depression. And there's a nice hiking path up to the right side of it. And you gotta be careful because further on, after the part where it was blasted shut, there's places where it caved in on its own, and it could be dangerous. There's a lot of holes up there that go down into either this mine or the Hacklebarney mine, and you would never want to get caught falling in one of those because I don't know if they'd ever be able to get you out. So this is the road at the bottom of Mount Pisgah, which is the bridle path for Kemmerer Mansion, and that path will take you out about a third of the way to Nesquehoning, and it drops down to the Route 209. It used to go all the way down to the Lehigh River. And the boys,
How cool is that? We should check
boys
that
used
out.
to ride their ponies back and forth on that trail.
Bridle path for Kemmerer Mansion.
So in between those roads, there were 3 of them. They were made by the diamond drillers, circa 1912, and looking for uranium. And they did find it. Let's take a drink. I thought I was going to have laryngitis this morning. I felt like I was coming down with it. Talking too much. See how we're doing for time. And there's the Kemmerer Mansion. It was a beautiful mansion. It was built by John Lysenring for his daughter and her husband as a wedding present.
The Kemmerer Mansion.
And his name was Malin Kemmerer. And they lived most of the time up in the Freeland area where they had coal mines. And the family later moved out to Wyoming, and they still have mines out in Wyoming, and the Kemmerer money, the Kemmerer fortune is still in existence. And they do, I believe they give us a yearly amount to take care of that park where the mansion used to be. But because they didn't live in it, it was vandalized all the time, so they tore it down in 1927. But the carriage house, that has been restored, and you can go through that, you can take a tour through it, and it's kind of nice. So again, a few more years, nothing's going on. They report that they're still digging and testing uranium out, but the trolley opened up new deposits of it, and they were looking to get the radium out this time because the radium could be used as a cancer treatment. Now, I mentioned the daughter products. Radium is one of the daughter products of uranium. Another one is radon gas, and we're going to talk a little bit more about radon gas later on. So, this Dr. Kelly said he was having miraculous cures of cancer using radium. But unfortunately, the rods of radium that they were sticking in the bodies of people would cause cancer in other parts of the body because the radiation was too high and it was too spread out over the body. Nowadays, when they do radiation treatments, they have a tightly focused beam that focuses mainly on the tumor. Now, Dr. Kelly was working with Alfred DuPont to create a nationwide production industry for radium for cancer treatment. Now, the DuPont family was well known in Mock Chunk. They owned powder magazines on the Broad Mountain, black powder magazines, since the 1830s. And these remains of these magazines are still there. And if you go on the internet, people claim that they're remnants of the village of Lausanne, but that's not true. Lausanne was buried, and it was closer to the river. These powder magazines are around James's Run. Now, Reverend Lyton Coleman, he was rector of St. Mark's Church from 1866 to 1874, and he was a close friend of the Packards. In fact, if you tour the mansion, I think sometimes they say that Mary Packard Cummings was having an affair with him, which I've never found any evidence for that. But he married Frances DuPont. He married well. He married up. He greatly married up, and she was the daughter of Alexis DuPont, and his connections then made him allowed him to become the Bishop of Delaware. His eyes are kind of creepy though. That's scary. So there's no more mentions of mock chunk uranium or radium deposits until World War II. And this is the atomic bomb being dropped on, I don't know if it's Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but it was, one of the bombs was a uranium bomb. I've actually read accounts now where they think we actually dropped three, some of the pilots claim that we dropped 3 bombs on Japan. The first one didn't go off. But one of them was a uranium bomb and one of them was a plutonium bomb. But in between all that time, there was no interest by our government in the mock chunk uranium deposits until October 1946. And this gentleman, Dr. Richmond Myers, he was giving a talk at the Mock Chunk Women's Club, which was in the YMCA building. And for those of you that have been around since the 50s, he wrote a column in the morning call on Sundays called Lehigh Valley. It was on Lehigh Valley, I forget the exact name, but he was a geologist, and a lot of his
Dr.
articles were on the
Richmond
geology
Myers,
of our
like
area,
Fort
the history of
Myers.
our area.
But it's
And,
Richmond
he wrote
Myers,
this book,
Dr.
Lehigh
Richmond
Valley
Myers.
Unsuspected. And in his talk, he said, "Do you realize that within half a mile of Mock Chunk is a deposit of one of the vital minerals used in the construction of the atomic bomb?" And everybody was like flabbergasted, like, what are you talking about? Because they had forgotten all about 30 years before that they were looking for uranium. And this quote was reported by the Mock Chunk Times News the following day. Well, somebody paid attention because the next year, the U.S. Atomic Weapons Program got interested in the Mock Chunk deposits. And mineralogists from State College came to Mock Chunk, visited the formation on the Northern Liberties, and he took samples with him. And he was working on a thesis. His name was Dr. Cook, and his wife was helping him with the thesis, and so were his children. And I like the idea that he had his kids there. And this is actually Liberty's Curve, and there's the coal port over there. And he's preparing
Had his children with him and his
weather balloon
wife,
to do some air sampling.
helping him prepare his thesis.
And his thesis was on geophysics, and he was a graduate of State College. He was a World War II vet, and his thesis was on radioactivity in the Mock Chunk area. And there's another nice picture of him on the Liberty's Curve. So, again, we don't hear anything more about it. You don't see anything in the newspapers for a few more years. Until this article in the Morning Call where it said there may be uranium in them there hills. Anyway, that's what Lehigh Navigation Coal Company is hoping. Drilling going on in the vicinity of Mock Chunk, research in LCN laboratories. And this happened because they were widening the curve at the Liberties. And every time they did anything to that curve, it exposed more of the uranium deposits. And this is one of the first tunnels driven in the 1950s. So there were 2 more driven in the 1950s for a total of 3 tunnels. I only ever remember 2. I don't ever remember seeing a 3rd tunnel. And they also began flying planes overhead, taking air samples of the air to see how much radioactivity was in the air over Mock Chunk. In 1955, Bosnia Contracting Company cut a road up the face of Mount Pisgah from near Dead Man's Spring, and that road is still there. If you're driving between Nesquehoning and Jim Thorpe, when you go a little bit past Dead Man's Spring, you can see a road going up there. It's pretty well grown in now. And I hiked up there in maybe 30 years ago, and found the core bore. The drill casing was still visible there when I went up there. Now, Jake once said, oh, that road was driven so they could search for coal. Well, that's not true. The coal was already stripped out of that mountain long before that. And it was intended to find more evidence of uranium. And I don't know what came with that study. I couldn't find that study anywhere. But in those years, the newspapers are full of articles of people searching for uranium on their property, all the way from Lehigh Gap, all the way up to Whitehaven and beyond. And people were driving shafts down into their property, especially people with farms. And they were reporting finding some uranium. And they had their own equipment, Geiger counters, everything. And a Nesquehoning gentleman named Harry Clement, he was involved in this whole study in our county, and he produced that booklet. And I guess about the same time, maybe about 30 years ago, I think I put an ad in the Valley Gazette saying that I was looking for information on this, and he brought this pamphlet down to my house, and I still have it. They were looking for uranium into the early 1960s until they finally gave up, because while there was uranium found, none of it was concentrated enough to be economically feasible to mine. And it's interesting that they said that, because if you look at a map of showing the amount of uranium under Pennsylvania, it's substantial. But out west, particularly in Colorado, the mines were more concentrated. And this is from a mine in Colorado, uranium mine, and this is some of the settling ponds that are associated with one of those mines. And we already have pretty much our whole county stripped out, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't find much uranium in our county or town, because Mount Pisgah would have been taken down to the ground. So, your moment of zen. In spite of everything we have just talked about, in October of 1958, the governor of Pennsylvania stated publicly that there was no uranium in Pennsylvania. There was no uranium in Pennsylvania. Governor George Leader and Miss Genevieve Blute, the secretary, said no Monday at a Schuylkill County Democratic rally. They were pointing with pride, as politicians will do, in a series of surveys made by geologists to find hidden resources in the state's 67 counties. One of the surveys dealt with uranium deposits around the state, including Schuylkill County. Well, what he probably meant, and he should have said, was there are no economically viable supplies of uranium in Pennsylvania. Wow. But in 1979 then, Otto Herman backfilled those tunnels on Mount Pisgah. Now, he backfilled them, but you can still go in them. And these are some photos taken by my friend Micah, who photographed them under a black light. And so the blue is not radiation. The blue is actually light from the black light. The deposits that are fluorescing are radioactive deposits, but he did mention to me that some of the more radioactive deposits didn't fluoresce.
Look at that. Look at that.
Again, you can see the fluorescing sources in there. Now,
Wow.
some of those could be radium, some of those could be carnotite, some of those could be other daughter products of the uranium decay. Without actually taking the samples and putting them in a mass spectrometer, you wouldn't be able to tell exactly what they are.
And that's just with regular daylight in there, without the black lights turned on, that's just gray rock. You
Yeah.
don't see anything looking out of the ordinary in there at all.
And I'm sure that you probably wouldn't be seeing pure uranium, because pure uranium, well, you wouldn't see it on a Geiger counter, because uranium emits a alpha particle, which I don't think the alpha particle would even get through into the detector. I think you have to have a special detector for an alpha particle. But you were detecting gamma rays, that's for sure, with the Geiger counter. They're more penetrating than an alpha particle. And that leads us to the radon problem, which, again, radon is the daughter product of the uranium decay. And our underground, Pennsylvania underground, is filled with uranium. And so there's a lot of radon gas being given off by that uranium. Well, the first mention that I could find in the newspapers of anybody seeing a problem with this radon gas was in 1983, when this man said, and he he was pointing out the fact that the houses that were starting to be constructed were so airtight in order to save energy that radon could really be a problem in the house because there wasn't enough air exchange. Some of the older houses, like especially around Nesquehoning and these other towns, they have so much air in leakage that it wouldn't be a problem. But the newer houses that were being constructed, especially in the Lehigh Valley at the time, he suspected that at some point in time that radon could become a problem. But after that, I saw nothing more for a couple of years. And so started construction on the Limerick Nuclear Generating Station. And this is what triggered the radon problem in the knowledge of the radon problem. This is what triggered it. Because in December of 1984, the construction engineer, he set off radiation monitors inside the power plant. Well, at that time, there was nothing radioactive in the site. They hadn't loaded fuel yet. So there should have been no impact on the radiation monitors. So that the engineers started investigating, and what they found was they had to go back to his house to find the source of this radiation, and it was from radon levels in his Berks County house. The family had to evacuate the house. Now, I don't know how long they were living there and how long their exposure was, but it was fairly high, the radon levels. And again, radon is another daughter product formed during the radioactive decay of uranium. And radon in turn is radioactive, and it emits something called an alpha particle. And these are heavy particles. Now, if you had an alpha source in front of you, you wouldn't have to worry about it because your skin actually would stop the alpha particle. A sheet of paper would stop it. But if you breathe in the gas, those heavy particles inside your body could damage your internal organs and cause cancer. And that's again why you would never want to drink uranium water. So these are the types of radiation that we currently know about. You have neutrons, which are generated in a nuclear reaction. You have gamma rays or X-rays, which pretty much we are exposed to for medical procedures. And then there are beta rays, which are high energy electrons, and there's the alpha particles, which can be stopped by a sheet of paper. So that's not a big deal typically, unless you ingest it, either through breathing or eating something or drinking something. So the family had to wait 6 months before they could return to their house so that it could be remediated. What's interesting is that when I worked at the power plant, everybody knew the story, but the story had morphed into that they had to bulldoze the house because the levels were so bad. So I was surprised when I found this article that said, oh, they were able to return. It just shows you how things can get changed over time, how stories change. So they were able to remediate and return to the family. And this incident then really, really brought to the public's attention that we have a problem in this state. So how does radon get into your house? Well, it comes from decay of uranium underground, and it could leak in from cracks in the foundations, from where pipes come up, even through the concrete, it could come through. And what do you do about it? Well, you can test. You can get one of these tests, and you can either get it on Amazon or your local hardware store. I'm sure they have it at True Value down here. Right?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
What's the matter?
Thank you.
They'll be done soon.
And they're not expensive. And what you do is you put these canisters around the house. So we did our house a couple times, and I put it in the most secluded area in the basement where there was not much airflow, and I put it near our coal bin for a reason I'll get into later. And then I put one upstairs, and they send you a report. Then you mail the canister back, and they send you a report, and it tells you what your radon level was. So this is from our house, and it was 0.8 picocuries per liter, and a curie is a measurement of radioactivity. And it's named after Madame Curie, who was the first person to experiment with radium, and she died from the radiation exposure. But they named the level of radioactivity, they named that after her in honor of it. So ours was 0.8 picocuries per liter, and that's good, it's a good value. So right there is the green level. 2.7 is kind of the point where you don't have to do anything about it. Above 2.7, you should keep testing, and if you're above 4, that's pretty bad, you should do something about it. Well, what could you do about it? You could remediate. And this is, actually, this is taken in my son's house down in Drexel Hill. So they have a problem all the way down there too. And what they do is they drill a hole into your concrete pad, and they put a pipe down into the gravel base underneath the pad, and then they run the pipe up to an outside fan. And this is outside the house, and there's a fan in there that continuously runs, and it vents the radon gas up and out of the house. Now, if you have a dirt floor in the basement, I'm not sure what they do for that. Well, does anybody remember passing the Liberty's Curve years ago? There was a water pipe that was stuck in the mountain there, and there was really great tasting water coming out, and people were always stopped there. Everybody cars parked there all the time. And they eventually closed it off. They said they had found fecal coliform in the water. Well, I wonder if it wasn't uranium that they found in that water. And they didn't want to tell anybody about it. And think about it, that's Mount Pisgah loaded with uranium. It's highly likely that that water had uranium in it. And that's what they found out fecal coliform. And so it's kind of, I know a lot of people complain, I know I was complaining when they closed it off because the water tasted good. But, water doesn't taste good with that. Anyway, and you can get your, if you have well water, and you should get it tested for uranium. Like we get our well water tested maybe every 5 years, just to make sure there's no fecal coliform or any other chemical in it. And you can get it, you can ask them to test for uranium. So I did it too, because I figured, there might be uranium in our water, and luckily there isn't. So what is uranium used for? Well, it's used in commercial nuclear power plants, and in the construction of nuclear weapons. Now, one of the bombs that we dropped on Japan was a uranium bomb. The other one was a plutonium bomb. Nowadays, the nuclear bombs are thermonuclear. They're hydrogen bombs. But they need a uranium bomb as a fuse. The uranium bomb, a fission bomb, creates enough energy and pressure that it can actually cause hydrogen to fuse and produce a thermonuclear reaction. Now, I found this out when I was researching all this, and it really interested me, how many warheads we had. So, we're the United States and Russia, we have the most, and together we produce 90% of the world's nuclear warheads. And as of 2019, we had over 6,000, almost 2,400 were retired, and 3,800 were part of the permanent U.S. stockpile. Since 1945, we produced more than 70,000 warheads. Russia produced 55,000 warheads. And altogether, all over the world, there were 128,000 thermonuclear weapons constructed since the 40s. So we know about commercial nuclear power accidents. We know about 3 Mile Island, we know about Chernobyl, we know about Fukushima. But we don't know a whole lot about the military accidents. Well, think there was never an accident when they were working or transporting or building 128,000 warheads? Think again. So, if you don't believe in miracles, this next accident I'm going to tell you about, it convinced me that there's miracles, because on January 23rd, 1961, a B-52 was carrying 2 thermonuclear bombs, hydrogen fusion bombs. The plane broke up in the air over North Carolina. Now, that's not a big deal. They've had planes break up and the bombs fall to the ground. They call that a broken arrow, and then they have to go find it. Well, in this case, and they've got 4 fuses on them. Well, this plane broke up and 4 warheads fell to the ground. Now, these bombs had 4 fuses on them. Each fuse would have to be activated for the bomb to go off. Well, in the process, 3 of the 4 fuses activated. The only thing that kept the bomb from going off was that final fuse. If that would have activated, that bomb would have gone off and it would have obliterated the eastern half of the United States. That's a miracle. Somebody up there was thinking about us. Mm-hmm. So this book is where I learned about that, and it's full of all these accidents. Well, we have these Minuteman silos out in the Midwest where the ICBMs are stored and where they're ready to take off. Well, they use a fuel that's very, very corrosive. And they've had these accidents where they develop leaks inside the silo and it builds up pressure. In one case, the pressure was so high that it blew the warhead out of the silo and onto a neighboring farm. Didn't go off, thankfully. Well, there's one more environmental hazard of uranium that I wasn't aware of until I started doing research for this, and that's its use in military ordnance. So we think about bullets and shells and all that being made out of lead because lead is such a dense material. Well, uranium is almost twice as dense as lead, so it's a better metal to use in bullets and in shells, especially in bunker busting weapons. So they use something that they call depleted uranium. And I talk to people and they're like, well, the uranium's depleted. Well, that doesn't mean anything. The only thing that means is that it's not as fissile enough to be used in a bomb or a power plant. It's still radioactive. It's still radioactive, it still emits alpha particles and other forms of radiation. It's dangerous to breathe in. And what happens is, we use these ammunition in both Gulf Wars, Serbia and Kosovo, and in Afghanistan. And resulting uranium dust storms create hazards for both soldiers and civilians. So I was researching this, and for a while, when they were studying the Gulf War syndrome, they suspected that the soldiers breathing in, and they did breathe in a lot of uranium dust from these shells going off, that they suspected that was what was causing the Gulf War syndrome. But they later concluded that it was the blowing up of the chemical weapons facilities over there. Well, that's it. That's all I have on uranium. If you have any questions? Any questions? Well, we'll have two more presentations this year. There'll be a Christmas